Our first speaker is Mazda Majidi, and Mazda is Mazda is a longtime social justice and anti-war activist with the Answer Coalition, who has written extensively on US intervention in the Middle East. So Mazda, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your great introduction. And thanks to you and everyone who has had a role in putting this discussion together. These discussions can be very useful. So I thought I'd start out by attempting to put this discussion in its historical context, which already Radhika did, by the way, but maybe I'll add to that a little bit. So why is it that the US seems to be losing its hegemony? Why are we even having this discussion? What has changed? If 20 years ago, if someone told me that the US would lose its hegemony in the region in 2 decades, I would have assumed that the people of the region were going to have successful revolutions. But unfortunately, the states in the region haven't gone progressive. Countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, Jordan, and others have not had revolutions. The region is still dominated by right-wing reactionary governments, many of them under the leadership or influence of Saudi Arabia, and their relationship to Israel that Radhika pointed to is another point that basically shows the nature, the character of these states. And it's not that the leaders of these states have now somehow changed their minds or decided to try a different approach. Only objective reality can cause this kind of change. So again, what has changed? I think what has changed is that the US has lost its aura of invincibility. The US no longer looks like an absolute power that can impose its will on all developments in the region. We have to go back to the 90s when, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the US was happy to be at the head of a unipolar world. The US was going to establish its hegemony across the globe. It was going to redraw the map of the Middle East to suit its interests. The US was going to overthrow every progressive state, every nationalist, every independent, or even semi-independent state, even ones that entered deals with the US on occasion. To recall where things were just 20 years ago, we have to remember the words of John Bolton after the US invasion of Iraq. He said, quote, "Iran and Syria should heed the lessons of Iraq," end quote. That lesson was supposed to be that anybody who does not toe Washington's line is doomed to be invaded, occupied, destroyed. So the occupation of Iraq did not go as planned. The US did not manage to install another client state in the region. Iraq did not turn into another Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. There was so much Iraqi resistance to the occupation that by the mid-2000s, the US had to give up on its dream of installing a client state. Instead, it modified its plans just to avoid the appearance of outright defeat. 20 years later, Iraq is not at all what the US had envisioned when it invaded and occupied Iraq. Of course, the people of Iraq have suffered tremendously, but the Iraqi state is not the stable, and it certainly is not an obedient client state. Afghanistan is another example of a US failure. It wasn't clear for a while, and the US did not suffer a catastrophic defeat on the battlefield. Still, what did the US do after 20 years? It ended up leaving Afghanistan and leaving the Taliban in power, the very same force that was in power before the US occupation. And it wasn't a graceful US exit either. The US exit from Afghanistan did not exactly portray the image of an all-powerful superpower. In Libya, which is, of course, North Africa, and in many ways, West Asia, Middle East, and North Africa are one regional political unit. But in Libya, the US and its NATO allies overthrew the nationalist state led by Muammar Gaddafi. But even this military intervention did not lead to a complete US victory, in that Libya today is anything but a stable client state. In Syria, short of an outright invasion, the US, its junior imperialist partners, and reactionary Arab states did everything they could to overthrow the Syrian state. Not just the US, but Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar spent millions upon millions of dollars to overthrow the Ba'ath Party government of Syria led by Bashar Assad. But it didn't work out for them. Iran and Russia intervened. Lebanon's Hezbollah intervened. And with their help, the Syrian Arab army and militias loyal to Assad held on. The forces that were called pro-democracy in the West, which were really different flavors of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, were largely defeated. Syria survived. And now Saudi Arabia and others are forced to acknowledge reality and reestablish relationships with Damascus. Even the timing of Saudi Arabia welcoming China into the region diplomatically speaks to the forced acceptance of the new realities. It came right after new hopes of the US, Saudi Arabia, Western European imperialists, and others, their hopes of a regime change in Iran faded. Saudi Arabia has now welcomed China's diplomacy, as Radhika said in her remarks. They welcomed China's diplomacy into the region, and the US is not happy about that. Today, even heads of client states in the region no longer think that the strength of the US military alone can shape the political scene and bend the realities to its will. Ever since the period after World War II, many oppressed countries or third world countries in the US camp have been referred to as client states, puppets, comprador, etc. The reason for this, and not necessarily as allies because they weren't on an equal footing with the US. The reason for this is that such states, by and large, did not represent their own country's aspirations for independence. Instead, they took their commands from Washington. They knew that if they crossed Washington, they were likely to be replaced in a coup or allowed to succumb to popular opposition within their country. Still, the puppet analogy, as useful as it might have been, hides one basic fact. A puppet or a client is only loyal to their imperialist master for self-interest or self-preservation. It's just that their self-interest and the interests of their imperialist masters often aligned. However, if those interests do not align, the client will not always remain loyal to the US. If a client thinks that the US side in a conflict may or may not win, that what the US is pushing for may or may not happen, why would they unconditionally obey and follow? Mohammed bin Salman is one of the most reactionary elements on the planet. He's even ruthless towards other members of the Saudi royal family. Western analysts sometimes talk about how bin Salman is now a little older and a little wiser, and that he has become more of a realist. That may well be true, but he is expanding his relationship with China because he is recognizing the reality that China is a major power and that it no longer makes sense for Saudi Arabia to be hostile to China just to please the US. So in a sense, we are looking at a new era in West Asia and North Africa. We have already seen this happen in other parts of the world, most notably in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. US policymakers are extremely worried about China extending its reach internationally, and they should be. However, for the people of the region, the erosion of US hegemony and expanding relationships with China is a positive development. It's not something to worry about. There is so much propaganda against China in the West that this turn of events is presented almost as an existential threat to humanity. But unlike the United States, China has not invaded dozens of countries. China does not have close to 1,000 bases in 80 countries around the world. China does not threaten countries with invasions, occupations, and coups d'etats. China does not openly intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. China does not state that it is time for Saddam to go, Assad to go, Gaddafi to go, and follow through with military action. China does not force aggressive economic restructuring plans on countries, forcing them to rapidly privatize industries and services. And while the US will give third world countries mostly assembly plants and service sector investments, think McDonald's and Starbucks, China helps build infrastructure such as power plants, dams, highways, bridges. There has been a lot of propaganda about China supposedly fleecing these countries, but in fact, the prices China has offered for projects have been much better than what the Western countries have offered. Their interest rates have been lower, and in many cases, they have even forgiven the debts. So the loss of US dominance in the region does not necessarily mean that the likes of Saudi Arabia are pivoting towards China strategically. Many of these countries may just want to add to their options. They may just want to use China for leverage in negotiating with the US, both on the economic and political level. Still, the loss of a decades-long US hegemony can only be a positive development for the region that can potentially open lots of other possibilities. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.